How are you all doing? It's been a while, but today we got another GTA Stories, and with so many comments we've gotten, I know this is an episode you all have been waiting for, and I hope you guys enjoy it. Me and Matt really upped the game for this one, because it covers an important shift in Toronto street culture and overall history. Also, don't forget to say something down below, because me and Matt always love to chat with you guys in the comments, which help grow this channel and series. Without further ado, today we're going to cover the history of the Jamestown Crips. Toronto is one of the safest, largest cities around the world, but over the last 2 decades has seen a surge in homicides due to the rise of gun violence and the spread of gang culture. Murder is not a new phenomenon to plague the city of Toronto, but gang-related homicides are a relatively new issue. With the problem starting to manifest in the 1980s, it would become a noticeable trend to police in the 1990s. There are many root causes to why, but today is a story of consequences in the aftermath of a city that would become one of the most gentrified in the country, with teens banding together to combat their increasingly hostile environment. They would become their own worst enemy. One group of teens would be influenced by the gang capital of the United States, Los Angeles, California, where hoods on the West Coast have been embroiled in a bloody turf war since the 1970s. Back then, it started out as a small group of friends that lived on the east side of South Central and would get in fistfights with rival neighborhoods. They created a criminal ideology that spread all the way to the United Kingdom, holds tens of thousands of members, and would become known as the Crips. The problem would be unrecognizable to the mass majority who weren't residents of these neighborhoods within Los Angeles. But the Crips had created divider lines all throughout the city that separated them from their arch rivals, the Bloods. And as the war had raged into the 1980s, the media and police had polarized Los Angeles' brand of gangbanging to the world. This led to some Blood and Crip members leaving Los Angeles to set up shop throughout cities across the United States. Cities like St. Louis, Memphis, and Detroit would become blood-tied, having original members from Los Angeles that had formed subsets within these cities. That's why you see neighborhoods across the South rep LA blocks, like the Rolling 60s Crips in Houston, Texas, and Grape Street Crips in Savannah, Georgia. But most cities in the northern United States, like Cleveland, Minneapolis, and Boston, artificially spread the ideology of Blood and Crips in the early 90s. South Central's gang culture had been depicted in popular media with movies like Colors and Boys in the Hood, which gave an accurate representation of what life was like in LA's most dangerous hoods. It would resonate with tens of thousands of teens across America, and as they related to the struggles depicted on screen, it led to teens using these popular gang monikers as a fear tactic to legitimize themselves against rival neighborhoods that might pose a threat. In Toronto, it would spread in a very similar fashion, and today has created a complex gangland of rival hoods that are cousin against cousin, Crip versus Crip, or blood against blood. Repping red or blue hold little value in today's street politics, with hoods falling under new alliances like the Shots Down and Shots Up movement, which is made up predominantly of a second generation of young men born into this cycle of violence who usually don't rep colors but still hold true to their roots by identifying as either Blood or Crip. In return, this made colors a thing of the past within Toronto, but still hold weight to a certain capacity in current times and have impacted the city of Toronto as much as any other city. But to understand how LA gang culture was adopted by youths across Toronto and led to a bloody revenge war that has now spanned almost 30 years, we need to go back to the year 1990. All the information I'm about to say is highly disputed, but the most agreed upon version is that the Bloods popped up first in Toronto, with a tight-knit crew of friends proclaiming themselves as Bloods in the Regent Park area. They would rep red flags and were involved in the street-level sale of hard drugs, but mostly marijuana. Having a heavy influence within the party scene in Toronto, they would spread the blood ideology to other neighborhoods like Pelham, Ardwick, and Vaughan Road. Homegrown gangs like the Looney Tunes, VR Troopers, and Jane and Finch Killers had allied themselves with Regent Park after a bitter rivalry kicked off in 1994 with Toronto's Rexdale area and the crews that resided there. Rexdale, also known as DoomsTown, would be home to Toronto's first Crip subset, known as the Newborn Crips, and they resided on Jamestown Crescent. It's not known why they chose the Crip moniker, but it's most likely to show animosity towards the Bloods that had been increasing in numbers, but weren't completely hostile towards each other, but tensions would rise as they both frequented parties throughout the Toronto area. This new alliance of gangs led by Regent Park, seeing the Crips as outsiders from a different city and the Youngblood generation spreading from Regent Park, had been clashing with Rexdale Crips, brawling at parties and bars within downtown Toronto. This led to the spread of the Newborn Crip ideology as more teens banded together under the new threat. The Newborn Crips popped up on Jamestown Crescent in 1992, but DoomsTown had already been a neighborhood with its own set of rules well before gangs rep blue in the area. With previous crews that had already controlled this part of the city, residents had become desensitized to the crime and homicide that plagued Rexdale, and they knew it was in their best interest to keep their mouths shut when law enforcement came around asking questions. In 1991, police were called to a house party at 45 Jamestown Crescent. Officers discovered Hopton Jr. Clark in critical condition, inflicted by gunshot. Clark later died in hospital, and police were hard-pressed to get any answers from the crowd that witnessed the shooting, stating more than 25 people were with Clark on the street when he was shot, with no one coming forth with any information. And this case still remains one of Toronto's many unsolved homicides. A year later, the Newborn Crips, who went on to claim the territory of Jamestown Crescent, would have the perfect environment to spread their ideology, and almost every resident would remain complacent to their presence or were full-out sympathetic towards the Crips and viewed them in a positive light. In 1993, a neighborhood to the east of Rexdale, known as Ardwick, had become claimed by a gang known as the Trife Kids. They were from the Galloway section of Scarborough, but held influence within other housing projects. The Trife Kids would also become allied with the Bloods from Regent after a deadly stabbing that took place at a reggae concert in 1994. Both the DoomsTown Crips and Trife Kids would attend the concert in downtown Toronto. On July 31st, a brawl would break out between the two groups at a social club, where multiple people were stabbed, and Vladimir Kreft, age 16, would be killed by a Crip from Rexdale. From what is known, he was not a member of any gang, but was friendly towards some of the Trife Kids at the party. His death would gain mass attention in the media. Vladimir was the son of Maurice Bishop, who was the Grenadian Prime Minister during the US invasion in 1983. Maurice Bishop was killed during the conflict, with Vladimir Kreft, his son, being raised in Toronto by his grandparents. Unfortunately, Toronto would not be the safe haven for Vladimir to escape the violence that had plagued his family, and his death would add an explosive element to the violence taking place in the city during this time. And it's unclear if it's related, but the next day, an unidentified 16-year-old teen would fire shots into a dance hall from the street. A 9mm round would strike a patron in the back before he fled the scene. With both this shooting and Vladimir Kreft's death taking place right near downtown Skydome. Numerous other shootings took place in 1994 throughout Rexdale and the GTA. In return, every individual member of the Rexdale Crips had become more desensitized to violence, the same going for other crews throughout the city, and there was no turning back. The culture in the streets would change. 1994 would see a spike in gun-related homicides. The first drive-by shooting in Ottawa's history would also take place, with it being alleged that it was carried out by members from the newborn Crips, which alludes to the fact that they were also committing violent acts in other cities. The homicide of Vladimir Kreft would be taken as a brazen attack launched by the Jamestown Crips, and now Regent Park, Ardwick, and Vaughan Road had all officially adopted the Blood moniker, who were all embroiled in the turf war with the Crips throughout the rest of the 1990s. Almost overnight, hoods throughout Toronto would ally themselves with Bloods or Crips depending on their predisposed issues with another area. By 1995, when Toronto's boroughs had been officially merged together and unified, the underworld during this time was the polar opposite. Crip subsets were popping up far beyond Rexdale now, with the second official subset forming in Jane and Finch, known as the Driftwood Crips, which they were under the banner of the newborn Crips from Jamestown Crescent, which had another subset known as the Ghetto Boys, and a third that came after Driftwood known as the Little Gangster Crips. And now that they had fully solidified their presence throughout Jane and Finch, turf lines were drawn in the area, separating the north being Crips and the south being Bloods. Later on, throughout the 90s, Rexdale became Crip Central, having the Stovetop Gangster Crips and O-Block Crips, who are both still active today, and numerous other cliques kept popping up. Old Jamestown cliques would just formally merge under the Jamestown crew. One notable member of the Jamestown Crips is well documented by the media, being Oliver Augustus Willis, otherwise known as Twinkie. Willis is believed to have formed key alliances in the late 90s and early 2000s with neighborhoods like Tandridge and Woolner. This only helped to spread Rexdale's influence on other areas throughout Toronto, with the Tandridge Gangster Crips popping up and another crew known as the Gators popping up in the Woolner area. This meant that Rexdale gang culture was spreading all throughout the GTA and created a vast network of drug dealers, stick-up artists, and pimps, who were all unified together to hold down turf lines. Oliver Twinkie Willis, who would go on to become a high-ranking member of the Jamestown crew, would first appear on the cops' radar in 2003, when he became the prime suspect in a shooting that took place after the Caravana Festival. When the victim, Amar Joseph Young, would attend an after-party with his two brothers, Amar would be standing on the street when a car pulled up and gunned him down. He was with his two brothers and multiple bystanders witnessed the shooting. All three brothers were also believed to be part of the Jamestown Crips, but only one of the two surviving brothers would come forth with information, stating he'd seen Twinkie commit the shooting, but later retracted this statement, saying that he couldn't see who had committed the murder of his brother. The police would try and press the second surviving brother, but he said that he feared for his life, and with the lack of evidence, the charges were dropped. Whether somebody's a part of the gang culture in Rexdale or not, it's within their best interest to keep quiet about the things they see, because in DoomsTown, the Crips have eyes everywhere. The police would undermine and discredit the sophistication of the gang within Jamestown, comparing them to the gangs they were trying to imitate within Los Angeles, but with law enforcement ignoring the problem. The Jamestown crew would still be able to flourish and hold influence within Rexdale. Numerous other beefs within the early 2000s had seen a shift in the street politics, and a small resurgence in the crack epidemic would appear again in 2005. With coke flooding the streets again, every gang in Toronto would look to expand their operations, and now that almost every homegrown gang had been replaced with Blood and Crip factions, their old alliances with each other were now compromised due to expanding into each other's territory. Separate Crip factions had began beefing over control of Toronto, with the Rexdale Crips now becoming hostile towards the Driftwood Crips and the Mount Olive Crips. They would both be allied together, and it's believed that they would have connections with the most influential motorcycle club in Canada, the Hells Angels, with the leader of the Mount Olive Crips having connections with the gang. The newly formed Up Top Crips card would also be an alliance between multiple gangs within Northside Jane and Finch. They would be allied with other crews like the Up Top Shoreham Crips, the Up Top G-Side Crips, and Driftwood was believed to have held most of the influence within this new movement which they had formed. All Rexdale Crips, like their allies in Tandridge, would still have strong links with each other, and some Rexdale Crips would replace the C in Crip with a K, to further separate themselves from rival Crips to the north. The Jamestown Crips became a powerful faction holding hundreds of members and were alleged to be heavily involved with the street sale of firearms and narcotics. They also had soldiers from Toronto's most feared gangs across the city to back them, having Black Creek's ruthless stick-up crew, the Junior Gators, and other various crews that were allied would help Jamestown become a household name within the streets of Toronto. But with the summer of 2005 being one of the most violent in decades, would see the police plan and carry out a massive raid that took place in 2006. The raid's main purpose was to get guns off the street, and Rexdale was believed to be the main distributor of firearms throughout Toronto. The police had also alleged that the Jamestown crew had been smuggling firearms from the US and also held connections with gun runners from First Nation reserves in Northern Ontario. More than 600 officers carried out arrests across Toronto, rounding up 106 Jamestown Crips members, including Oliver Twinkie Willis, who faced charges for possession of 2 loaded handguns. He would be sentenced to 3 years. This would be a massive blow to the Jamestown crew, but with multiple high-ranking members like Oliver Twinkie Willis being back on the streets within a couple of years would see the operations of the Jamestown crew continue. A younger generation had also continued the presence and influence of the crew in the streets, making the politics at the time even more complex. And after these raids, there was little change in terms of gun violence on the streets of Toronto. The police had spent millions of dollars installing surveillance cameras and bumping up patrols throughout housing complexes, and by 2002 had a 92% success rate in solving homicides, but still ceased to understand the bloody cycle that plagued the streets of Toronto. When one gang is dismantled, the culture is still in place, and another crew will take over from where they left off, unless the issue is solved from the ground up. With the Up Top Crips movement still holding hundreds of members and the Rexdale Crips also still being active, would see another raid take place in 2010 known as Project Coral. Law enforcement would yet again round up multiple key players and high-ranking members, with also seeing another familiar face again, Oliver Twinkie Willis, who was involved in a drug smuggling plot that the police had uncovered, where Twinkie and 2 other Italian associates flew from Canada to the Dominican Republic in hopes of importing 72 kilos of cocaine back to Toronto. At the same time, the police had confirmed a growing suspicion they had, believing high-ranking members of multiple street gangs had connections to organized crime, and would use this arrest to try and prove that the Falstaff Crips had indeed been involved in a gang war with a rival gang, due to them having separate supply chains and were expanding into each other's turf. Numerous innocent people had been killed in the crossfire during this time, but it is still unknown to what extent the Falstaff Crips and 5 Point General's tensions contributed to these murders. Oliver Twinkie Willis was sentenced to 10 years in the Dominican Republic, but the Canadian government would push to extradite Willis back to Canada. After serving 2 years, the Dominican Republic acquitted Willis, where he was sent back to Toronto. When he arrived back in the country, he faced drug smuggling charges along with a firearms charge. The media had painted Oliver Willis as a ruthless gang leader who had a massive presence in the street. His chances weren't looking good, but Oliver was extremely remorseful and admitted to his role that he played in the drug smuggling plot, stating he was sorry that he endangered society and that he would commit to going on the right path. The Crown sentenced Willis to 5 years in prison. Some people believe that he played the system, with others believing that he truly wanted to change. Law enforcement also contributed to Oliver's character, stating that he was very intelligent and polite during the hearings, and with so many different stances on his case, they believed that he deserved a second chance. He had also already served 2 years in the Dominican Republic, which means he technically would be serving 7 years in total. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. Did he play the system, or did the Crown actually make a proper decision with this case? The Jamestown crew is still active to some capacity within Rexdale, along with other gangs in the area, and it's unclear what Willis did after being released, but people assume he got right back into his old habits, because in 2018 he was gunned down in a suburban district within Mississauga. He would be living in Brampton at this time, and his family would have nothing but good things to say about Oliver, but didn't really add any information on his status in the street at the time. Oliver's face would not appear on an annual account of all the victims lost to gun violence in Mississauga in 2018 due to his controversial past, but he was still a person, and Oliver had two sides to him, just like everyone else. But majority of the time, the good outweighs the bad in the eyes of the public. Crips are still extremely active throughout the GTA, including Jamestown, O-Block, Driftwood, and Tandridge. As well, new Crip factions have formed in the city, and from researching this story, the streets are as complex and as chaotic as they have ever been. The towns, being Jamestown Crescent now, would be inherited by a new generation of youths who control the area. Also, towns in Regent Park are friendly towards each other today, which goes to show that things can change for the better, but it took a generation of bloodshed and a revenge war that just shifted into another. The ideology of the Crips have also spread to other cities in Canada, predominantly in Hamilton, Montreal, and Halifax, all of them having ties to the original sets from Toronto, and the Crips have become a staple of gang culture in Canada, with their counterpart the Bloods having just as much influence, but that will be a story for another day. So, I hope you guys enjoyed that episode. If you did, don't forget to like and comment, and leave a suggestion on what you would like to be seen covered next on GTA Stories. And with that, I hope you all have a good one, and I'll catch you in the comments.